Hello and welcome to the Deckbuilders buffet here at MTG Another Look. These card suggestion videos are like a buffet where you try a little of this, a little of that, and leave behind the cards that don't work for you. With that said, grab a plate and let's take another look at some commander cards that you might be missing out on. Let's talk about Price of Progress. It was originally printed all the way back in Exodus. It's an instant that costs 1 and a red. Price of Progress deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. Price of Progress is one of the best burn spells in Commander, if not the best. It has the capability of doing dozens of damage to your opponents and yourself for only 2 mana and at instant speed. Price of Progress wins games. It's pretty conservative to expect about a dozen damage to each opponent in the mid to late game. Commander players have absolutely no reservations about packing their decks full of non-basic lands, and including only a handful or less of basic lands. Many players put one basic land of each color, just in case, and pack their decks with every utility land they can get their hands on. While including a basic of each land type is a good habit, and it may be necessary to build your mana base that way in a 5 or 4 color deck, it is so greedy. Traditionally, one of the hindrances of going 4 or 5 colors was the unreliability of getting access to all of your colors when you need it, but nowadays that is almost a non-existent problem. And it's because of non-basic lands like the triomes and fetch lands. But even in 1 and 2 color decks, people overload on non-basics. The new MDFC lands from Modern Horizons 3 has just exacerbated the problem. Some of them are clearly good and worth a spot in most decks, like Witch Enchanter or Sink in the Stupor, but packing a bunch of the ones with worse effects that come into play tapped into decks because they think it has no opportunity cost is a great way to have a clunky mana base. And packing a bunch of MDFCs and utility lands are going to make you get punished even harder by something like Winds of Abandon or Price of Progress. And frankly, at that point, you'll deserve it. I would recommend players be a lot more discerning about whether each utility land is worth it. Cards like Arcane Lighthouse or even Reliquary Tower are rarely worth it. They mess up your consistency and are rarely relevant. There are some cases where they are worth it, but I think they're pretty overplayed. Anyway, back to Price of Progress. Price of Progress can be an amazing top deck and a great finisher. It can be an Oops I Win card when you draw it and your opponents have 6 or more non-basics out. Even when you're playing a deck with an average number of non-basics, it's still a pretty great inclusion in those decks. You get to choose when to cast it, so you get to decide when it'll be worth it. Even hitting yourself for 8 or so damage can sometimes be worth it when it'll hurt your opponents more. Even if the effect just dealt 10 damage to each player, it's still sometimes worth it for you to lower everyone's life total. Price of Progress can be especially devastating in Spellslinger decks that can copy it. It can turn a 2 mana deal 10 into a 2 mana deal 20 when you have your permanents that copy spells. There are very few cheap burn spells that can have that kind of impact. It's also great with cards like Isochron Scepter, a combo that can knock out everyone over a few turns, or Sunforager, which can search it out of your deck. I especially love Price of Progress in Judith Carnage Connoisseur, since she'll gain you back all the life you'd lose playing it. It can be a one-sided huge burst of damage in green decks that can search up lots of basic lands and copy spells, like Wart the Raid Mother. Playing it in an aggressive deck that wants to attack can give you the reach you need to finish opponents off, but playing it in decks where the damage can be one-sided is even more silly. Rem Careless Stalwart Slayer can prevent the damage to yourself and tack on 1 extra damage to each opponent to add insult to injury. Try out Price of Progress. You'll be astonished how much power you'll have in your hands. Speaking of an astonishing amount of power, how about Wilderness Elemental? Wilderness Elemental was originally printed in Cold Snap. It's a star 3 elemental for 1, a red, and a green. It has Trample, and its power is equal to the number of non-basic lands your opponents control. So, we just talked about how oversaturated mana bases are with non-basic lands, and this counts the non-basic lands each of your opponents control. If each of them has 3, it's a 9/3 for 3 mana with Trample. That's a dangerous attacker that'll continually grow, since no one wants to be missing land drops, but it attacking isn't why I'm bringing it up. Wilderness Elemental combined with cards like Terror of the Peaks or Warstorm Surge will deal dumb amounts of damage for just 3 mana. With one of these effects on board in the mid to late game, you can easily deal 10 to 20 damage to a target, and probably take an opponent out of the game. It combines with all the typical Power Matters effects. Fling effects, or something like Mage Slayer, take advantage of the elemental's unreasonably large power. These Power Matters style decks will often play Shakedown Heavy or Pugnacious Hammerskull, which are definitely more consistent in the first 3 turns, but after that, the Wilderness Elemental can easily surpass or even double their built-in powers for the same mana value. Wilderness Elemental gets overlooked a lot in these types of archetypes, but really consider how often you see non-basic lands, and whether it's a good fit in something like Zayatora the Incinerator or Tuya Bearclaw. It can also be nearly impossible to destroy from damage in a deck with Zalortha Strength Incarnate on board. Next up is Beseech the Queen from Shadowmoor. It's a sorcery whose mana cost is 3 black 2-brid mana symbols, meaning it can be cast for as little as 3 black mana, or for each of the 3 black mana you can't or don't want to pay, you can pay 2 colorless instead. Search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Beseech the Queen is a very playable and relatively cheap tutor. Its mana cost is flexible, but really shines in mono black or 2-color decks. It kinda seems to be overlooked compared to the other good tutors, and it's much cheaper monetarily than most of them. At time of writing, it's less than $4, which is very affordable for this kind of effect. It does limit you to finding something with a mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control, but almost all of the time, that won't be any kind of significant hindrance. A lot of the more affordable tutors have much more significant restrictions, like the recently printed Grim Servant, which requires board setup in the form of devotion, or something like Infernal Tutor, which is a relatively stringent requirement of being empty-handed. Beseech the Queen just requires you to be able to pay something close to triple black and have lands. Pretty easy to accomplish for decks in color. Beseech the Queen is an option to keep in mind for decks with a tougher budget restriction, but still wants to be good and have this kind of flexibility. Something like Veto Thorn of the Duskrose, which can be semi-budget, but wants to find its other combo piece, would love something like this. Decks with semi-unsupported themes that really want to find certain cards, like Iname Death Aspect, who really wants to have its mass reanimation spell on hand when it needs it, can make good use of this. A budget deck that can recast it repeatedly, like Magar of the Magic Strings, can also be a good fit. Reenact the Crime from Karlov Manor is up next. It's an instant that costs 1 and 3 blue mana. Exile target non-land card in a graveyard that was put there from anywhere this turn. Copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. This card is a pretty flexible card that can punch way above its weight class when things line up. You do have to keep up 4 mana with 3 of it blue and cast it on the turn when the thing you want to target hits the graveyard, but you can snipe some really absurd things with it. At worst, it's an okay instant speed clone or memory plunder, both cards that are a little fringe, but Reenact the Crime is either one when you need it, which helps a lot. Since it's an instant, you can even copy things in the graveyard that you normally wouldn't be able to, like the original Ulamog or Kozilek. Not only will the Titans not get shuffled back in, but when you get one of your own, you get the cast trigger from them too. Not bad. Without reaching the ceiling of what this card can do, you can just take a good spell your opponents cast or discards, like a Magma Opus, even if they just use it to ramp with a treasure. You can definitely do things like that yourself as well, since it doesn't specify what graveyard you can take spells from. Cycling an Angel of the Ruins and then copying it to get a token copy of the Angel, and its ETB trigger and a turn, isn't going to break the game or anything, but that's pretty good value when you want to use your mana before you untap for your turn. There are so many scenarios where this card's flexibility can turn into an advantage. Reenact the Crime will be best in mono blue decks or 2-color decks, and those that'll be incidentally milling yourself and your opponents will give it the most options. It works well in something like Phoenix God of Deception, since you'll be milling someone a lot. It can play well with Saruman of Many Colors, since it incidentally mills opponents and already wants to be stealing things from their graveyards. Or decks that surveil and discard, and may want to reanimate, can make good use of it too, like Mirko Obsessive Theorist. Last up is Covax Ascendant Hero from Planar Chaos. It's a 4/4 human noble for 4 and 2 white. His abilities are other white creatures get +1/+1, non-white creatures get -1/-1, pay 2 life, return Covax Ascendant Hero to its owner's hand. Covax, being from Planar Chaos, is an effect that we almost never see in mono white. -X effects are almost always in black. He and Elish Norn Grand Cenobite are the only two I know of that have a static effect like this. The abilities are a little different because Elish Norn will debuff opponent's creatures and buff yours, while with Covax it can be a little more wonky. Your white creatures will get the Anthem effect, and so will your opponent's white creatures. Your non-white creatures will get the debuff, as well as those of your opponents. You do need to be a little careful about when you play this or what decks you put it in. However, this powerful -X effect is so rare in white that Covax is still a valuable game piece. He can pump an army of tokens like a regular Anthem if they're white, and shrink or kill your opponent's creatures. If you're in mono white, he will almost certainly play both roles well, and if there's ever a point where having Covax on board will be detrimental to your game plan, like if you have Mirror Battlesphere tokens out and don't want them to cease existing, you can always bounce him back to your hand by paying 2 life. He can also dodge board wipes that way, which can make him an ever-present threat and a challenge for decks in other colors with small creatures. Covax is great in go-wide token decks like Darien, King of Kieldor, or in decks that care about its creatures being pumped like Kutzil, Malamut, Exemplar. Anything that goes wide with white creatures like Maya, Bredegard, Protector can benefit from a hard-to-dispatch Lord effect that makes it harder to block your small creatures. Thank you for watching, everybody. What do you think about the cards we discussed today? Are these cards diamonds in the rough, or just more rough? Are there any cards you think are hidden gems? Let me know in the comments down below, and give the video a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I will see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.